Welcome everyone to the Jewish Study Center, our class on Survivors Talmud, which you will find is a very interesting subject. My name is Jerry Garfinkel. I'm the treasurer of the Jewish Study Center. And as such, I want to remind you that we welcome donations. All of our Zoom classes are free, but we do have expenses. One expense is to pay for the Zoom services we have now. We have other expenses. So donations are encouraged. And on our website, there's a place to say donate. You can donate by check or by credit card or by PayPal, anyone you want to use. Another thing to remind you is today's session is being recorded, and everyone will be muted until the very end of the presentation. If you have questions or comments, please write them in the chat box and address them to everyone. If you're not familiar with Zoom, there's Zoom controls, usually at the bottom of the monitor if you're having a computer, and then at the bottom there is a place that talks about chat. Another thing in the bottom is reactions, so you can raise your hand virtually if you need to say something very, very badly. Otherwise, all the comments and questions will come towards the end. Mindy Reiser, our vice president, will be looking at all the questions and she'll be asking them at the end of the session. Okay, before I introduce Mindy, I want to make one announcement. Of course, today is National Day of Mourning for the dozens of people who died at the Lag BaOmer celebration in Israel a few days ago. Of course, also many people were injured, so we certainly honor the people who died and were injured. I want to introduce our Vice President, Mindy Reiser. She will be actually introducing the speaker of the day and the subject matter. So, Mindy?
Yes. Okay, I hope I'm unmuted. That's always a challenge. Can you all hear me?
Unmuted.
Am I unmuted?
Yes.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. We're delighted you've chosen to spend part of your Sunday afternoon with us. I am also very delighted to introduce our speaker, and I think you will have an extremely enlightening presentation. And the Study Center is very pleased to bring these opportunities to you all. All right, Jackie is going to be talking about the Survivors Talmud, which is sometimes called the Us Army Talmud. And it's the amazing saga, how a set of the Shas came to be printed for the Jews in displaced persons camps following the Holocaust. The fact that the printing was under the auspices of the US Army is not the only fascinating fact about this edition. For the last 10 years, Jackie Ben-Efraim has been searching for the heretofore unknown illustrator who created the moving title page, which you will soon see, which depicts a concentration camp. With the help of Jackie's fellow members of the Association of Jewish Libraries, in which she plays an important role, she was able to discover this artist's identity, which she will share in her presentation, along with other anecdotes about the struggle to create religious materials for those who survived the horrors of World War II. And now I want to say a word about Jackie Ben-Efraim. She is a local girl for those of us who are tuning in from Silver Spring, Maryland. And she started her college career at the University of Maryland. She moved to New York to complete her undergraduate degree as well as her master's in library science at Columbia University. She was an intern at the YIVO Library as part of her master's degree program. Jackie then moved to Los Angeles in 1980, where she studied at the University of California, Los Angeles Rare Book School, and has taken courses in book conservation under the direction of the head of preservation at the Huntington Library. For the past 15 years, Jackie has been the Special Collections Librarian in the Ostrow Library's Lowy-Winkler Family Rare Book Room, and this is at American Jewish University in Los Angeles. Twice a year, she creates exhibits from materials from the Lowy-Winkler Family Rare Book Center, and these collections often include a single volume from the Survivors Talmud to provide a source for the chosen subject matter. Jackie hopes that in 2022, she can mount an in-depth on-site exhibit about this historic edition of the Survivors Talmud and other items created for displaced persons. And now let us go to Jackie.
Thank you, Mindy, for the wonderful introduction. And here I am in the Lowy-Winkler. Actually, no, I'm in Bethesda, Maryland, visiting my mother. And it's because of my parents that I became interested in this particular edition of Talmud. When I first started working at American Jewish University, or AJU, my father asked me, Martin Kamerow, Zichrono Livracha, if the Lowy-Winkler held a set of the Survivors Talmud. I had been away from the field for a while, and I wasn't familiar with this edition of Talmud. But being a good librarian, I did take the time to investigate and provide the information that my patron was seeking. That yes, indeed, AJU held a full set of this edition. And when we finally had it, it wasn't on that visit, on a subsequent visit when my parents were looking, and we opened it and saw the title page, we were completely moved to tears. And then I noticed that the signature of this artist who so touched our souls wasn't identifiable. And thus began this quest. So I'm going to share my screen. All right. 1 second, it's still loading here. There we are. So once World War II had begun, Jews started fleeing, and even while the war was going on, Jewish refugees in Shanghai decided that they needed a set of Talmud so that they could study. So they created a set of the Shanghai Talmud, which was a small octavo, or 8-inch high set on newsprint. That was a copy of the famous Vilna Shas. The Vilna Shas, first of all, Shas stands for the Shisha Sigarim of Mishnah, does not stand for a political party. This will be an apolitical event. So the Vilna Shas was printed in 1886 by the widow Rome, and obviously Vilna. It is the standard for Talmudic printing going forward from 1886. It added indices and all kinds of special features that made it a better study guide than previous editions. So you already had refugees while the war was raging printing Talmud. And as I said, the Shanghai Talmud was the size of this Daf Yomi on the right side of my screen. And the larger Vilna Shas is the size of this Talmud Bavli on the other side, which is a full folio at 20 inches. Now, this is not the Survivors Talmud. This was a Talmud I happened to be at home cataloging during shutdown. But the images were so squashed on the page before, I wanted you to understand the difference, because size will matter when we start talking about the actual printing process. And just in case you've never seen the inside of a Talmud, Here is a page and from Brachot from the first volume with a mission in the center, Rashi on the inside, and then on what would be the left-hand side, you have the other commentators and glosses. That way you have an idea of, and I've actually heard a page of Talmud being called an early internet page, because you can have a comment and it will refer to something else and you just keep, well, you aren't clicking through it because it's paper, but it refers to other pages. Okay, so, oops. After World War II, the Jews were in DP camps that were often the very same camps that were the ones the Nazis had used to try to exterminate us. So the conditions were deplorable, shortage of food, and President Harry S. Truman ordered a commission to look into the situation. And just in case your photos are, your faces are covering the quote, this is what Truman said. Apparently, it is being taken for granted that all displaced persons, irrespective of their former persecution or the likelihood that their repatriation or resettlement will be delayed, must remain in camps, many of which are overcrowded and heavily guarded. Some of these camps are the very ones where these people were herded together, starved, tortured, and made to witness the death of their fellow inmates and relatives. So this is a wonderful picture of Truman that was signed to my grandfather. By the way, during this speech, I will mention displaced persons as DPs. They are also sometimes known as Sharita Pleta, the remaining remnant. So Truman's little speech provided for the DPs the opportunity to receive food, clothing, shelter, and books. He ordered specifically books for education, and the US government stepped up to the plate and provided both religious and secular editions. So the first effort by the US Army was this Survivors Haggadah. Now, this is not the first edition of the Survivors Haggadah that they created for themselves with artwork by survivors, but Rabbi Chaplain Abraham Klausner, in order to lead a Seder he was planning to work on, arranged to have it printed by the Army, and therefore you have the US Third Army insignia, that A inside of a circle, blue circle, red circle, blue circle. That is why that's on the cover. Now let's look inside. So the artist Miklos Adler compared the slaves of Egypt to the Jews in the Nazi concentration camps, because as you look at these people, they do not look like they're living in biblical times, but are contemporaries, or contemporaries in the 1940s. And this is the page that says, Avadim hayinu leparo b'Mitzrayim, we were slaves unto Pharaoh in Egypt. So that's the contemporary artwork by Miklos Adler. And then on the left, you have a page that's really more like an illuminated manuscript and more like traditional Haggadot. You have a large incipio, that's a large letter bet or base. And inside of this bet, at the very top, you have pyramids, because that's what we were doing as slaves in Egypt. And then the very bottom, tying it together to contemporary times, you have barbed wire. And remember barbed wire because we will be continually talking about barbed wire in the artwork. So this is the verse, B'chol dor v'dor. In every generation, we must feel ourselves as if we went out of Egypt. So how much more could the survivors of the Holocaust feel as they marched into freedom? Another item that was printed this time, not by the Army, but by Vad Hatzalah. So this is a Pirkei Avot, Pirkei Avot being Ethics of the Fathers, and Vad Hatzalah is the rescue committee that was formed to save rabbis and yeshiva students during World War II. And then afterwards, they turned around and helped restart Jewish life. Just as when we left Egypt, it took stages for our ancestors to move back to a holy state in the land of Israel. So to those who had been in the Holocaust, many of whom had lost their faith or just didn't have the ability, many of whom remained religious despite the penalty of death if they had been caught studying or praying. So there was a rebirth in religious interest. And this particular volume belonged to Rabbi Samuel M. Neches, and he was the first rabbi at the Breed Street Shul. The Breed Street is a famous synagogue in Los Angeles. It was the first building built specifically as a synagogue, very historic. So the Vaad Hatzalah also printed several of the tractates of Talmud, and this one happens to be at the Lowy-Winkler Rare Book Center. It's Yavamot, and it is very fragile. It is on the very most thin newsprint you could imagine, but at least they were beginning to get some works into the hands of the students in the small yeshivot that were popping up in the different DP camps. Now moving on to St. Otillian edition of the Talmud. And some people might say this is like the first edition, or this is the Munich St. Otillian edition of the Survivors Talmud. There was only a printing of two tractates that was available. A monk at St. Otillian was a monastery, and a monk saw some Jews studying Talmud by heart because they had no books. And he ran into the monastery library and pulled out a tractate that they happened to hold. And thus was born the idea, let's reprint a full, glorious, folio-sized set of Talmud. So on the right, I tried to blow up as best I could. Now, AJU does not hold the St. Otillian. This is a copy from the page at Yad Vashem. And thank you. I see Lital Beher is here today. And thank you for all of your help. So in the cart that's on the title page, you can see corpses of our brother Jews. And then you see some huts. Before I go, I'll talk about that, we'll come back. So the top of the page, just below the sun, you have the quote, from despair to redemption, from darkness to a great light. This is this very tiny writing just below the sun. And just below the sun, and this quote is from the Haggadah. It's also from Talmud. Below the huts, at the very bottom in that little white strip of the page, you will see it says, Tzlif avodah shebo yashavnu hitpalanu v'lamanu b'chashai. There we sat and we prayed and we studied in secret. So very, very personal statement. This is we, the survivors ourselves. This artwork with the hut and the idealized Jerusalem is unsigned. I found a wonderful photograph by Benjamin Reif, a photographic artist, of St. Otillian. And in it, a cart very similar to the one we have on the title page. You have a talit and a cross. The cross is very difficult to see, but when it's very blown up, you would. Showing the unity of the Jews in St. Otillian working with the monks to bring forth this printing of about 3,000 volumes. And they were printed, the plates were made in Munich by Bruckmann and printed at the Herder print work right there at St. Otillian's. So this unity between the monks and the Jews is represented in this photograph. Father Marinus, priest there at St. Otillian, said that working on this project brought him and his fellow monks a great deal of comfort following the horrors of World War II. So it didn't just redeem us. So I've mentioned Vadhatsala a few times, and here you have, this is a page from a quarterly publication by Vadhatsala, again on newsprint, and in the background facing us, the center figure with the blackest hat, that is Rabbi Samuel Abba Sneg, the chief rabbi of the U.S. zone. He himself was a survivor, and he had previously been a chaplain in the Lithuanian army. He was born in Kovno. Along with his fellow rabbi, Samuel Rose, who also was from Kovno, they approached a U.S. Army chaplain in the lower right corner, Rabbi Philip S. Bernstein, who later on became the American advisor on Jewish affairs. And they pitched the idea, let's print an entire set of full folio Talmud to distribute among all of the students in the different yeshivot and DP camps. They also approached General Clay. So, went too soon. So here we have Rabbi Rose, and we are going to talk about the plates. We went too far. So Gerd Corman wrote an article about the U.S. Army and the Talmud. This is the groundbreaking article about the idea of printing and the history of printing the Survivors Talmud. He suggested in his article that the United States, the State Department, suggested that perhaps, since we can't suggest the DPs go to Palestine because of the British mandate, and the British are our allies, maybe this Talmud project would be a nice substitute. Bernstein, the chaplain over there, said the Talmud was not just a religious work, but something of historic value, when he was trying to answer people at the State Department who opposed the idea, saying there weren't enough religious Jews in the DP camps to make it a worthy project. And finally, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson said, the Babylonian Talmud, our oral law, is the very soul of our people and the life of our exile. And finally, General Joseph T. McNarney approved the project on September 11th, 1946. So they finally decided it was worthy. So I mentioned it's very large. So here is Rabbi Rose, and he is proofreading 8 pages that all are printed on one sheet of paper. That is huge. So even though we had the approval from the U.S. Army for this project, we were lacking paper because obviously it took a huge amount and it wasn't created during the war. And all of a sudden, that was 1946, the approval. In 1947, the Army said, no, we can only use paper for government official printing. So we don't have paper for your project. Then Jewish GIs gave up their rations for chocolate and cigarettes. And Rabbi Nathan Baruch, also from Vadhatsala, arranged to have people change on the black market those coupons, those ration coupons, in exchange for paper. And it still wasn't enough. And this is when they brought in the Joint Distribution Committee. No, please hang up. The Joint Distribution Committee, so that they could bring paper from Sweden, because they needed 500,000 sheets for the 2,711 pages that made one 19-volume set. And they were going to be printing 650 sets. So that is a lot of huge sheets. Now we're talking about small pages, but huge sheets of paper. This wasn't the only stumbling block to getting this project off the ground. You needed a printing press. The Interdepartmental Committee for the Acquisition of Foreign Publications, the ICD, was given the task of re-educating Nazified Germans. In order to complete their mission, the ICD was given radio, theater, newspapers, and the press. They needed press so they could print new materials. And this is how it came to be that there was a printing press at Heidelberg, Karl Winter, and the Karl Winter plant had just printed Nazi propaganda. So this is really poetic justice. But note, printers were often offered extra food ration coupons for helping the US Army. At this time, the Jewish DPs were getting more rations than the German citizens for food. Food was also in short supply. Everything's in short supply. So the chemicals were in short supply. The photo offset process requires chemicals. David Davidson in the ICD traded wheels of cheese with the British for the zinc required to create plates for printing. The collodion for flexible film wasn't made during World War II, and the only cash was in the Soviet zone. But the US Army didn't have the same friendly relationship with the Soviets as they did with the British, and there was no trading going on, so that had to be imported. But worst of all, there was no set of Talmud from which you could make the photo offset, because you all know well about Kristallnacht, and that most of the volumes were burned or pulped into books or taken off to be used for a museum about Jews when they supposedly would have been annihilated. And they did find 2 volumes in a Munich cemetery, but that wasn't of the quality to do a photo offset. And there was a whole question with the Offenbach Depot, what volumes were available, who owned them, and they couldn't access them. And in the United States, yeshivot didn't have volumes of Talmud to spare because they depended on Europe up until World War II for all of their printing needs. So that was really quite a problem. And finally, on the Lower East Side at Resnick Books on Broadway, they found 2 sets of the Vilna Shas. Now, it wasn't the first edition, it was the second edition from 1897, which we know because there was a question about where was Masechet, the section on Makot, and it wasn't after Sanhedrin where it's normally found. And in this particular set, it was in Bava Kama. So if it was in Bava Kama in the Survivors Talmud, it was in Bava Kama in the 1897 edition, and that's how they identified which one it was. And then, of course, that had to be shipped on a boat, no FedEx. So finally, they start printing in 48. So they started in 46, we're already up to 1948. And everyone knows what happened in 1948. The state of Israel was declared. So at this point, you begin to have many of the Jewish DPs leaving the camps for Israel. And those were the intended end usage patrons, right? So now the focus of the printing is going to shift to be more of a historic landmark effort, perhaps a fundraising effort to have this edition be distributed. And they finished printing in 1950. So now let's look at the title page. So this is the 1948 with a Heidelberg. And you have a new title page. You still have people in the wagon, the corpses in the wagon, but now you have people actually loading bodies. You have the Sonderkommander loading them into the cart. You still have the low huts. Jerusalem has now been shrunk. And we still have the quote, under Jerusalem, Mishibud Legula, Mafela Or Gadol. Again, still that quote about darkness to light. And this looks more like a shar, a title page in traditional religious books with the 2 pillars. It's a more familiar look. Below, at the bottom where the camp is, you have barbed wire. I said we're going to keep talking about barbed wire. And the quote, instead of saying we studied, has turned into a more generic, that just as it's a camp in the days of the Nazis, because they're not trying to say that because the people who are going to be receiving them are not the survivors. So they changed that quote. And in the very bottom left corner is a teeny tiny signature of one Gimel Rosenkrantz. And we will get to him in just a moment. But again, Rosenkrantz, familiar name, and for 10 years, I didn't know who he was. But to sit there and look at the redemption at following such horrors as being burned and massacred, he deserves our attention. But real fast, I want to make some notes about the artwork. So the obvious thing is that the page is yellow. And this is turning the yellow badge of shame the Nazis had us wear, Jewish stars, turns that shame into hope. And usually yellow is a signal for hope, like sunshine, in most cultures of the world. All right, so we have, again, the huts. This is the Kaufering concentration camp where Gimel Rosenkrantz was interred. And thank you so much to Helga Deiler, who is here today from the European Holocaust Memorial, who helped me with this photograph and understanding how the huts were built. I've yet to visit myself, but I do plan to do so. So now we know that these huts aren't just some artist's idea, but the actual places where he suffered. All right, so the palm tree on the title page. Well, E.M. Lillian, a very famous Jewish artist in the late 19th, early 20th century, was in a morgue, coming from Lithuania down into, in Ostrow down into Israel, was in a morgue of the palm trees. Well, palm trees are a very Jewish symbol that dates back to the day of both the Tanakh, the Bible, and the Talmud. We are instructed to use them to make our sukkot, or the booths, in the book of Nehemiah. The date palm also symbolizes sanctity, peace, and immortality. So immortality, how much more important to show that we, the Jewish people, have become immortal. We survived the horrors. And so that having a date palm, let's go back and look this again at the title page. We have date palms, and yes, we have survived. Now, on the other side, we have a page, again by E.M. Lillian, and this is from a book of German poems for Jews. This is on the page next to a poem about Yizkor for Yom Kippur. So you have at the very bottom these ivy and these brambles, and they're all full of thorns. And those thorns look eerily like barbed wire to me, and it seemed very fitting, since obviously both Rosenkrantz and Adler, who created these survivors Haggadah, would have been familiar with E.M. Lillian's work because he was so well known at that time. As I mentioned, all we have on that title page is Gimel Rosenkrantz. And I didn't know who he was, and of course, such a common name made him difficult to find. I was taking any piece of artwork that had any kind of lettering in any of the books about Kovno Ghetto by Esther Laurie with all of her group of artist friends. I took anything with lettering, and I would compare them. I would blow them up, compare them to the handwriting, but nothing matched until I had the help from Lital Be'er, as I said, from Yad Vashem, and she had heard something by Julia Schneiderwin in Munich about Grisha Rosenkrantz. Lital was able to pull out this poster on the left that says Yizkor, remember, and of course, clearly you can see 6 million, and still using that theme of yellow. And it is in the testimony of Grisha Rosenkrantz, the official testimony that he left. So that was signed by him, and at the bottom you can clearly see there's a signature, which I blew up for you, and the Survivors Talmud This is my Sefer Brachot at American Jewish University. Blew up that signature line. And finally, I had a perfect match. And between the testimony information that was at Yad Vashem and the help of others, we were able to say conclusively he was the artist. Furthermore, there was some contact information, and I was able to get in touch with his son to see, yes, indeed, that he was the artist. So Grisha had other children and a first wife before World War II. Both of the children were, of course, murdered by the Nazis at Auschwitz. But Aliza, if you look at the sketch, the artwork is clearly the same as style of Jacob Lifshitz, who is a famous artist who died in Dachau. Well, this caused some confusion. Some people I had spoken to said, the cover art of the Survivors Talmud is by Jacob Lifshitz, and they had seen this photo and somehow connected to his name, and they were sure that it was Jacob Lifshitz. Well, that wasn't possible because he died in Auschwitz. And I did provide you a small sketch of a woman he had done, so you can see the similarity of style. Furthermore, Jacob Lifshitz's widow ended up marrying Grisha Rosenkranz's brother, so they are connected in some manner. So now you get to meet Grisha. So this is the military pass that he was given by the US Army so he could travel between camps. DPs couldn't just go anywhere. So he had special permission. He was working on this project. He was also giving instruction. So he has this pass. One of the reasons it was so hard to track down Grisha, any of you who've done genealogical research are well aware of the multiple spellings of anyone's name. So far, I've come across 17, and I haven't even scratched Cyrillic. And I don't read Cyrillic, so that will be a problem. But you can see why it was kind of hard to find information about him. But he is listed in another spelling of Sharita Pleta. This publication was created by Vadhatsala for the survivors to find other survivors and also, people, family members from overseas to find if their loved ones had survived. And Grisha Rosenkrantz is Gers Riesenkrantz on page 27. And you can now find this digitized courtesy of Ken Schoen Books. And I will afterwards provide a link to where you can look on this online, as well as the complete Survivors Talmud online. So you could look at this close and you'll have controls to blow it up or reduce it or anything else you would like to do. Another photos of Grisha. We have a photo of him and he's still looking fairly young. And this is yet another piece of confusion. In a blog in the National Library of Israel many, many years ago, someone had heard that the artist of the Survivors Talmud was a young man. But Grisha was born in 1903. By 1946, he was not a young man, but he actually looks fairly good for someone who survived the horrors that he endured as a slave laborer in Kaufering. And this is above a piece of artwork that he created, a design for theater. Remember I mentioned ICD had control of theater and that many Jewish DPs created all kinds of plays. And this is a very macabre play making fun of the Holocaust. Now the photograph on the right is when he is much older and he's been living in Miami and teaching at B'nai David Synagogue. So let me give you a full rundown of his biography. He was born in Kovna and he studied at yeshiva and he was on the transport together with Rabbi Sneed. So that's maybe how they knew each other and was picked for this project. He graduated high school in Charkov, Russia. That's why I need Cyrillics. And then he went to college, the College of Art and Education in Lithuania. He taught Hebrew at the Hebrew Gymnasium of Kovno for 14 years. Later, he was interred in the Kovno ghetto and part of that group with Esther Laurie, who created secret works for the Jewish community, as well as a slave laborer when they were moved to Kaufering, the camp with the low huts. He was a slave laborer for the Nazis creating artwork. I have yet to see an image of any artwork he created for the Nazis, and I would be very interested in seeing anything that was created by him. And then, of course, at the end of the war, marched to Dachau. And that's why this is Dachau Liberation Day, was this week. He also, in his later years in Miami, taught at B'nai David, as well as he taught art at the academies of Miami and Hebrew at the University of Miami. And he was the artist for the program on PBS called Living Hebrew. So while you were studying Hebrew, you had him doing the calligraphy, showing you how to do the Hebrew alphabet. I assume, because I've yet to see a recording of the PBS broadcast, which I would love to be able to see if anyone knows where that is. So what had happened to the volumes? The DPs had been deported, the DPs had been able to either make Aliyah to Israel or get into other countries, and you have all these volumes. Well, first of all, they planned a huge special celebration for presenting these special copies to the important people who made it possible. Of course, the first being the President of the United States, Harry S. Truman. So you can see that here is a volume that has that in gilt on the cover. This is in a private collection. It was planned, as you can see, they wrote to David Niles, Truman's advisor, let's plan this ceremony, we're going to give it to you. And they had tried to get together a coordinated plan to give one volume at the same moment to President Truman, then General Eisenhower in Europe, and Chaim Weizmann in Israel. But it was very difficult. This is 1949, and you have still the War of Independence going on. Harry Truman is busy also because he's President of the United States. It wasn't very easy, and they certainly didn't have Zoom where they could just carve out 5 minutes and everyone get theirs at the same time. And they decided to change their emphasis to presenting this at a United Jewish Appeal Conference in New York in January of 49. They decided to give up on this big joint presentation, and he never received it. Truman never received it, not because he was anti-Semitic, or because DPs didn't want to give it to him because they felt slighted that he didn't visit when he was in Europe. He never planned to visit the camps. The camps were still filled with diseases such as typhus, and there was very short schedule. That wasn't in the plan, and they weren't insulted. And it wasn't that Truman didn't want to accept it to upset the Arabs because the United States needed oil. That wasn't the reason either. It was just a lack of time. Truman did receive the Torah from the state of Israel. He also received the Bible. So it's certainly, a Tanakh in Hebrew, he certainly was not anti-Semitic. And the official presentation to the United States for gratitude was given to General Clay, who had a much more hands-on in the process of having this presentation done. I believe that's Rabbi Rose to our back, with his back to us. You can see the title, and let me share with you more. And I don't know what that, there we go. And now I'll show you where the rest of the volumes went. So as you can see on this wonderful little map, my apologies to South America. I could not get the tip to fit in the slide. And copies went all around the world, including Montevideo. And I know this for a fact because I've had a wonderful research assistant, my son Asaf, who has been plowing through the JDC online archive to go through the letters that discuss the distribution of every single volume. And sometimes places were given sets, like most of the copies that went to Israel were full sets of Talmud because they needed to have for their yeshivot. The ones that went to the US and Canada, 25 full sets were given to institutions of higher learning, such as University of Judaism, which is American Jewish University. There was a slight name change during a merger. So I have now, thanks to my son, found the copy of the official letter that decided that that then brand new, formed in 49, University of Judaism was receiving a set. And you'll notice that there are 50 sets for Germany. The 50 sets that were being given to Germany were the ones promised to the US Army as part of their cooperation in getting this printed. So they went to US Army libraries across the bases, and believe it or not, soldiers wanted to read. They were kind of like bookmobiles, and who knew that the US Army had bookmobiles? But I think that's a lecture all unto itself. Many of the places where you only see one, that means one volume was sent where there wasn't really anyone who needed a set to study from, but they wanted to have a volume. And 5 cents went to Hungary. So right now I'm corresponding with a librarian at the Jewish Theological Seminary there and trying to find, is the set still there? According to the letters from the JDC, they should have one. I am trying to find every extant volume that is still, together. If someone has one, if they have the entire set, per the suggestion of Lenore Bell at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and I believe she's also visiting with us today, she suggested having a global holdings record. And during the Q&A, I'll drop the link to that. If you have any edition at all, San Otillian, Heidelberg, one volume, everything, I'd love to hear from you and make a record of it. So it won't, your private information won't be shared publicly, but just so that I can make a wonderful history of where these volumes started and where they ended up and how they're being used. Because definitely the set for which I am the steward, it has been used by students nonstop from 1949 till my father asked for them. And I realized how special this edition was. Because at this point, we are taking, I'm encouraging everyone to take their set, their single volume, and cherish it. It is a rare book. Not that the intended use was to be a rare book, but the historic fact that the US Army helped this project off the ground, the absolutely breathtakingly moving title page. This is now a rare book. Please don't stick it in the trunk of your car and drive around with it all summer. So this is what this project is. So when I talked about this last year, one second, I need to sit. I heard from my colleague from the Association of Jewish Libraries, the librarian at Bar Ilan, Yaakov Aronson, about a set that was in Gush Etzion. So here at Yeshiva Har Etzion, in their library, their set is very unusual. It is not from the original 650 that were printed by the US Army and JDC. A donor, a supporter of this yeshiva in the 80s was traveling in Europe and stopped by the Carl Winter plant. And while taking the tour, mentioned his interest in the Survivors Talmud that had been printed there. And the printer said, here we have unbound pages, which turned out to be one full set and then some extra pages. The patron, this wonderful donor for the yeshiva, said, let me buy them. And the printer said, no, let me bind them for you and give them to you. So Carl Winter Printworks bound the set in beautiful leather, and they are now sitting at Har Etzion. The odd pages went with the donor. You might be wondering, where are the plates that created all of these? They're also in Israel. I'm not sure of the exact location at the moment, but they were given to Rabbi Snig, who was, by the time he made Aliyah in 53, was very old and very frail, and it was thought that he could use them to print off a few more copies to use the income to support himself, but that did not happen. And there's a large discussion about how many copies really were printed. So once again, I urge you to contact me afterwards so I can be sure and have your set counted. I'd like to end before the Q&A with a beautiful quote That is from the verso, that's the back of the title page. This edition of the Talmud is dedicated to the United States Army. This army played a major role in the rescue of the Jewish people from total annihilation, and after the defeat of Hitler, bore the major burden of sustaining the DPs of the Jewish faith. This special edition of the Talmud, published in the very land where, but a short time ago, everything Jewish and of Jewish inspiration was an anathema, will remain a symbol of the indestructibility of the Torah. The Jewish DPs will never forget the generous impulses and unprecedented humanitarianism of the American forces, to whom we owe so much. And then, in the name of the rabbinical organization, Rabbi Samuel A. Sneed. Now, the Hebrew dedication is much longer, and you are welcome to read it when I put in the link for the full set. And that is the end of my formal presentation. And I'm ready for questions.
Okay. I hope you can hear me.
I hear you just fine, yeah.
All right. Okay, let's give Jackie a minute or two to catch her breath after an extraordinary presentation where I think all of us learned information we had no conception of and expands our understanding of what happened with survivors and the U.S. Army. I'm going to pose a few questions. I really welcome questions on the chat, and please think about what you'd like to post and I will share them, but let's get started. I want Jackie to tell us a little bit, if she can, more about how the survivors themselves responded to the printing. You said the extraordinary devotion of people to reciting the Talmud Ba'al Peh, by heart, but certainly having the copies made a difference. So perhaps you could say a bit about that.
Well, what I said was by the time they finally got it printed, they didn't have paper, they didn't have sets of Talmud, it took them so long to get everything that they needed together that the camps were really emptying. Now, camps were emptying out of Jews. Mind you, there were DPs who were not Jewish who were there for several more years, but the DPs had left by the time it was completed and fully distributed. It was distributed to every Jewish chaplain who had served the DPs got one volume, who were very impressed by it. And the JDC archive, all the letters going back and forth, rabbis begging for even one volume all across America, and like a couple of letters from Hungary and the one letter from Montevideo. And I've only scratched the surface of this huge archive. The rabbis around the world were clamoring for a piece of this because of the historic significance of the U.S. Army and because of the absolutely astoundingly moving title page. I managed to get through this without crying over the title page.
Okay, does the Jewish Theological Seminary, Yeshiva University, the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, do they have copies?
So I know that JTS has sets. I know that Yeshiva University, matter of fact, the whole story about by Soloveitchik figuring out which was the source Talmud for the Survivors Talmud, because he had seen the Survivors Talmud and knew where the one Masechet was. He said, oh, that's a very unusual one. So that had to be the 1897 Vilna Shas. So that's from Yeshiva University, has a large archive about the Vadat Sala. Brandeis University has two, I believe HUC, and I have a whole list of places that might have them. And that's why in a moment, I'm going to post in the chat a place where you can post your copy or share the link with someone who you think has a copy. And it's really important. We want to know where they are because they are now really special volumes. They were intended to be study volumes. The set I care for is truly been used and loved, that we want them pulled now and saved for posterity to show how we can in the future look back and learn from history. But I can't yet trace every one of those institutions that received them because they've all been on lockdown.
Okay.
I have letters from people, we haven't been back in our library yet, because I keep asking, did somebody inscribe it, whatever. People are just going back to work. So this is the next chapter, is where are they now?
Okay.
So,
in terms of where are they now, we have folks who maybe at some point will try to track them down.
yeah, I'm posting this link here.
Okay.
So the first link was to the digitized version. So if you want to, for yourself, look at every single page of the entire 19 volumes, they were at that first link.
All right, great. Does the Library of Congress have a set? Somebody asked.
Yes, yes. Library of Congress has 2 sets.
2 sets, fantastic. Somebody asked Miriam Marr, she wants to know what happened to the volumes in Tunisia and Morocco.
I haven't gotten there yet because everyone's been online. I
right.
only was able to unlock this key when I came across I had gone through the first cache of the Friedman archive in the JDC, and I had gone through every one of those documents and traced that back. And then I found this, when I stopped looking for Talmud and started looking for Shas, it was like Pandora's box. And that's when I called in my son and said, yeah, because not a single one of those were indexed in a way that you knew what they were about. And he has gone and made a key and has been instrumental in this.
You said some extraordinary things about the role of Jewish U.S. Army people contributing their rations, chocolate and some other things, very precious. Can you say a little bit more about the engagement of Jewish Army people in this project?
I have come across dozens of photos of GIs lovingly rescuing, you think of the monument men, and then other GIs just wherever they were going through and seeing something, either a Torah, an actual Torah scroll or other books of importance, and pulling them with reverence. So even though many of the US GIs who were Jewish weren't necessarily religious, they understood the significance and did their best to make restitution. The whole thing with the Offenbach Depot and how long, there's a wonderful book about that right now, if you really want to know about how all those things were, again, brought back to us for our use, use of the Jewish people. I don't want to say us because there may be people here today who aren't even Jewish. And thank you, for all of your help in my research. Again, Helga's here, and she has been instrumental. She's among the righteous who helped reinstitute interest in what went on in the camps in Kaufering, and has given me so much guidance along with Mary Jane. I believe Rachelson is here, and so much. Her father was also there at Kaufering. So a lot of people have given me help. Not all of them were directly connected to this story.
Okay. What role did armies of other governments or other governments have in supporting this? Our allies, for example?
Well, the only one I know for sure about is when the guy from the ICD traded cheese, David Davidson, who was Jewish, Davidson, traded cheese for the zinc that we needed to make plates. So the British were cooperating, but there was this little dance because the British had the British mandate, and they didn't want more Jews to upset the balance, Jews to Arabs ratio in mandatory Palestine. So that was kind of a dance there. The only thing I came across vis-a-vis the Soviets was they weren't approached because there wasn't the same rapport with the counterparts to the ICD. Remember, the ICD was really a ring of spies. A book recently came out about that as well. That when they were, even during the war, gathering periodicals from the foreign countries, ostensibly for historic purposes, we should have information from the other side of the story during the war. They were spying.
Okay, we have a question from Paulette Benson, which of course our ears perked up. A number of us know this, but she underscores this. And she says, the US State Department has been notoriously anti-Semitic in the 1930s and probably the 1940s. So what in the end motivated them to support this work?
Well, again, this is not my area of research.
Mhm.
I said the State Department felt, one of the comments was they had felt it was inappropriate to print this religious work when so few of them are religious. And then Rabbi Bernstein, the Reform chaplain, said, it's not just a religious work. This is a historic statement. See, this very religious rabbi saying it actually represents us as a people. But basically, Truman said, do this. It really came from the top that we are the U.S. is to provide this support, what they need. And when you have these marching orders from your commander-in-chief, it was, and don't forget, we keep calling it the U.S. Army Talmud, but they really paid, besides for providing the press, they paid really for 50 sets, and most of the money came from the Joint Distribution Committee.
Okay. I was intrigued, as I'm sure many of us were, with the involvement of the monastery. And I wonder if you have any further information, what impact this engagement had on the monks and how the word spread to other monasteries for the colleagues and families of the monks themselves.
I actually don't know beyond the quote from Father Marinus. I don't know more information, and the few articles I saw were in German. I know that Helga Deiler is here. Do you know anything more about the monasteries? Can you unmute? Do you know anything more? You would have to be able to be unmuted. Do you see Manfred Deiler? Oh, actually, I can unmute you. Nope. Helga, can you unmute?
Now I can. Now do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, now you hear me. Well, we have been at a symposium in St. Otillian. Also, the brother of Mary Jane Rochelson have been there. And we, of course, asked the monks, what is behind this story? And of course, you can imagine at the time when that, because the monastery was also a DP hospital, where many Jewish children were born. And of course, it was a problem between the monks and the Jewish section of the monastery, because the monks had been, during the Nazi time, they had been kicked out of the monastery. And of course, after the liberation, they wanted to have their monastery back and their whole monastery. And so I think it was really a problem also in this time. But as we heard in the symposium, they did get along after quite of time, after a while. And so, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. We have another question for Miriam Marr. You've touched on this, but perhaps you could amplify. She asked if were the volumes all reset in Germany, or was there a photographic process?
The entire printing is photographic. It is not, don't think of Gutenberg and every little letter being set, letterpress. No, by this point it is all photo offset. That's why we needed chemicals for that process. Although ink is as a chemical too, but this was all photo offset.
Can I ask a question? If it's all photo offset, how comes the rabbi was doing proofreading of the sheet?
Quality control. And it says proofreading, and maybe he's just making sure nothing is smeared, because especially if God's name is smeared, then it wouldn't be okay. But you're right, he really probably didn't need proofreading, and it was a Vilna Shah. So, but you know, anything that was printed along, because it's a photo offset of something that had been printed on a press many years ago, there's always a place for mistakes. Yeah, many books in the rare book room where there are, like in the King James, infamous mistakes, where just, one letter wrong or flipped, whatever, can have a terrible meaning, completely wrong meaning. So, and I guess kept him busy, gave him the opportunity to study. Those were...
Okay, we're getting close to the end of truly an extraordinary presentation. Does anyone want to post anything in the chat or raise your hand?
Okay.
All right, I'm not seeing anything. Let me give Jackie a chance for any final observations.
Well, the final observation is I stopped my virtual background because somebody has said hello to my mother. As I said, my father because he probably read the Gerd Corman article all those years ago. But
I know how he came to ask you about it.
Why?
Because his friend was a chaplain who had gone into the camps, one of the first to enter one of the camps. I don't remember which one. Sandy Sandhouse.
That's right.
And had talked to him about it. And that's what occasioned Daddy asking you to research it.
Oh, that's a wonderful piece of information, which you didn't know before, Jackie. Is that right?
Actually, he had mentioned, because unfortunately, by the time I found the answer, I'm going to keep, because I know that somebody wanted to say hi to my mom, is Janice, a couple of cousins out there. My father asked this before he had passed away, and by the time I found the answer, he wasn't
Together.
he had Alzheimer's, and I left Yad Vashem, don't want to say happy, but satisfied that with the help of the many people I mentioned today and many more from the Association of Jewish Libraries who aren't here today, I found the answer. I was able to give tribute to the artist and find out more information. I'm still finding out more. But the information I needed from my father, my mother just now had mentioned, had been something in passing. But I truly think my father did read the Gerd Corman article because it was in a journal on Jewish American history. I'm fairly certain that he had a personal subscription. So, and he was a voracious reader with there are books all over this house, except for the room I'm actually sitting in. It only has cookbooks, but
And there's children's books.
Oh, and children's books. Very important to remember children's books.